Okay, thank you very much. Yes, my focus is on supporting quality teaching by out-of-field teachers of mathematics, and it's certainly been an interesting day / afternoon, evening to hear all what's going on around the world, and there's some very common themes, but there's some very distinct things, which I think is really fascinating. Where I am, I wish I was in Shanghai. I have been there once and loved it, would love to go back. But down here in Australia, and my project's based in Victoria, where Deakin University is. So like others, I just would like to briefly acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm coming. You may have heard, as was mentioned earlier, that devastatingly to many of us, our referendum to acknowledge and listen to our First Nations people was rejected. So it's a pretty sad place, and it's kind of a bit conflicting to acknowledge traditional owners today, but I still want to do so. So as has been mentioned, it's a continuum. Sometimes when we hear the words out of field and infield, people do think it's a dichotomy, but I don't think most of us working in the field believe that's the case, and I certainly don't, and we don't in my project. So my focus, I just have to move the people, is about so teaching, not teacher quality, is about what teachers do in the classroom, and teacher qualifications are one of the inputs that potentially impacts what teachers do. And Shah et al. Recently stated that all other things are equal, teachers with domain-specific expertise, that is qualifications, should be more effective than teachers without such expertise. And that's certainly the assumption which we're really basing our project on in maths education. Get the technology working. So I've sort of picked my theme as the extent of the phenomena, which is interesting given all that's going on, but there's a lot of data around the world. Some of them, so this is from the International Maths and Science study, and one of the year levels, and that is year 8. And one of the complications in defining out of field is that it varies so much, not just in the local place, but also in what the data is, and sometimes we don't really know who's being talked about. So in the TIMS, the most recent TIMS data we have, year 8, you can see the claim is that 72% had teachers who'd majored in mathematics. So that's in one of these circles, where we're looking at whether the teachers have a major in maths, a major in maths education, or what combination. Of course, there's 15% of people are missing from this Venn diagram that was reported here. And in PISA, which is looking at what students who are able to leave school should be able to do, and it's got many OECD countries in that, they say that the quality of learning cannot exceed the quality of teaching, which I think is a really interesting statement that we should be thinking about. But they also say, which is pretty relevant to what we're doing here, is we need to attract and retain qualified teachers and ensure they continue to learn throughout their careers. And that's really important. So in the same data, but with relevance to Australia, and I think this echoes what's been said by many of the other presenters, that in Australia, out-of-field teachers of mathematics are more likely to be on temporary contracts, have had less teaching experience, attend less professional learning, be less satisfied with teaching and with their current job than in-field teachers of mathematics. It suggests that 1/5 of teachers teaching year 10 in Australia in that particular year said they were not qualified to teach at year 10. That's self-reported data. Obviously, different places around the world, it's in teaching maths in Australia, typically we are generalists, so year 7 maths, it's not like in the US we've heard from today, it's not just a whole year of algebra or something like that. It's a combination of all the sub-disciplines within mathematics. And that's all the way through to year 7 to 12 in Victoria, certainly in most of Australia. So I'm qualified to teach mathematics in a secondary school, which means I can teach from year 7 all the way through to year 12. So unlike in science, we don't separate out our qualifications. So we don't, there's a chemistry teacher, there's a physics teacher. We're just maths teachers, even though we have different maths units. There's different pathways. So at my university, but in Australia, you have to have both discipline units and methods units, whatever your pathway. We can have undergraduate pathways, and this is just at Deakin. Undergraduate pathways, so school leavers deciding they want to be teachers of mathematics, for example, seems to be a much less common pathway these days and I think that's really university decisions more than what students are deciding. So we tend to have more who do a 3-year degree first, a Bachelor of Science or a Bachelor of Arts or something, and then come into what we call a Master of Teaching and do a 2-year. But we do have some combined things. And how much that impacts on how prepared teachers are to teach is something that's worth considering. So the qualification is one thing, but then who teaches? So now I'm really just focusing in on Victoria. So in Victoria, in Australia, it's the states that decide what's taught and who teaches, even though we, in theory, have an Australian curriculum, it's still not implemented the same across different states, and we can have our own local curriculum, which we do. So in Victoria, once you're accredited to teach and you're registered by the Victorian Institute of Teaching, you can volunteer, be asked, be told to teach mathematics. Our registration in Victoria is to teach. It's not to teach mathematics, even though you need that to become registered to teach in the first instance. So teaching maths in secondary school, anyone could be doing it. They could be willing or reluctant. And the support, as has been mentioned a few times, can range from basically nothing to substantive support. And we've certainly found that in our project, in our graduate certificate, sometimes we actually have teachers teaching in school at the level, exactly the maximum level they've gone to. We also have primary teachers, qualified teachers, teaching in secondary settings for a variety of reasons. And in Victoria, primary teachers are generalist teachers, which is good because they are ready to teach maths, but normally that's up to typically grade 6 is in primary, but they are qualified to teach up to year 8, but they're certainly teaching beyond that in many cases as well. And their preparation will vary depending on what university they went to and at what stage. So how recently they did their qualification. They might have done 1 unit of maths education. They might have done 4. Everything varies. I might just skip this slide because I think it's more about the definitions vary so much depending on who's doing the talking. One thing I think I should go into the conversation is, where does teacher perception of their out of fieldness, or whatever term we want to use, how does that impact in what we consider to be out of field, and what are all the other factors? So in Australia, in year 7 to 10, there could be 21%, but it's more likely really if you go with our qualifications, it's 38% of classes in year 7 to 10 are taught by out-of-field teachers. And Prince and O'Connor have actually suggested that over the 4 years of schooling their year 7 to 10, the probability that you're going to have an out-of-field teacher at least once is 3/4. And that can happen twice is more than 1/3. So it's definitely highly prevalent. Others have talked about Schulman, and that's certainly what the focus that we use. And Schulman talked about 3 dimensions of teaching: mathematical content knowledge, mathematical pedagogical content knowledge, and curricular knowledge. And these together underpin teacher capacity. And the mathematical content knowledge, that is knowing maths for teaching, is a core component of professional competence. And so I think I'll just skip to the last thing, keeping in mind the time. Watson and Mason talk about effective teachers drawing on their knowledge as they're able to act in the moment through having possibilities come to mind. And that's quite important in the approach we take. So the Victorian government decided to try to meet some of their goals that I've listed here. For example, increase the proportion of students at year 9 achieving the highest level of mathematics and so on. as being one of their goals. So I'm only talking about the graduate certificate for secondary mathematics, but parallel to that, there was a graduate certificate. There is a graduate certificate of secondary science. The government wants high quality, well-trained teachers. And they talk about this to attract newly trained teachers and targeted retraining of teachers. They acknowledge the persistent issue of out-of-field teachers and suggest it's about to become more acute, although I would suggest their interest in out-of-field teachers is reducing already. The expectation for our course was that in 1 year, we would be able to shift teachers from being out-of-field to in-field the following year. We had 20 days of face-to-face classes across 4 units in the year, 125 to 150 teachers, and half the participants would have come from rural and regional schools. That was the aim. And the department was going to select currently practicing teachers, so qualified teachers teaching maths, but that's not what they're qualified to teach. And so some of the issues which might be worth, thinking about for other people. So it was funded by the department. The target population was those currently teaching, but that wasn't necessarily who was then enrolled in the course. Initially, as I said, it was 4 units, 2 per semester in 1 year, though we're into the 3rd cohort, and that's now changed to being over 2 years. I would suggest there was some political KPIs that impacted. We ended up having more, greater numbers than what was in the tender in the mathematics course, and that created substantive issues for us. Advertising and expectations by the department was also problematic in whether it's what they said or what was interpreted by people, teachers, in what the expectation was. In other words, a graduate certificate versus 20 days of professional learning. The funding, people talked about funding before. The course was paid for by the department or the government, and funds were allocated to the school as well. But how the funds were spent at the school level is decided by the principal, and that varied from every extreme possible. And there was also very supportive school culture in a whole range of ways. So just thinking about cohort 1, as I said, so there was this more than a 20% over enrollment. We had to split into 2 days, problems with staff, problems with everything. And one of the issues for me thinking about one of my recommendations is start small where possible, because starting with 175 or 220 students the next year is a big challenge. As I said, the recruitment, there were issues. So there was some uncertainty on the part of the enrolled participants. And as I said, some of that might be their interpretation, some of it might be what the department said. In terms of the enrolment, as I said, it was supposed to be teachers who'd been teaching for 1 to 5 years, teaching maths out of field for 1 to 5 years. And in fact, we had a substantive number of teachers who'd never taught mathematics before. We also had quite a few first-year teachers, obviously, who had no experience in teaching, as has been said in other, already got challenges in beginning teaching, which I'm sure everyone here knows is no easy thing. So all these disruptive actions created, and the final thing really is, unfortunately, we all know the pandemic. So having planned a course face-to-face, we went into lockdown. We had quite a substantive lockdown in Melbourne. It wasn't quite as bad in outer Victoria, but we had combined, they're all coming into the city for study. So we went for online classes. So in terms of the theme, the prevalence is really high, and teaching quality, as has been said elsewhere, is impacted. And one of the issues from the particular discipline of mathematics is, and I can't speak for any other disciplines, but mathematics teachers typically revert to how they were taught maths in school, or how they prefer to be taught, or how they think students learn best. And Schulman talks about this as a dorsal signature pedagogy. We often hear about this transmission knowledge of teaching, pouring the knowledge into someone's brain. You can see the teacher at the blackboard, and even though it might be changed slightly with the technology, this signature pedagogy is still really prevalent. I actually prefer the dorsal fin pedagogy, which is what I imagine. And we found in our project by what the teachers said and what they did both in class and in their assessment tasks, we learned quite a lot about what was going on in Victorian state schools. And certainly the prevailing views were not in favour of student-centred approaches, and they saw that as the teacher not doing anything. And the level of scaffolding was really high in task scaffolding versus what really evidence-based practice in maths education would suggest. And in addition, it's not the way that I ran out of time.
Yes, you have. Yep, so maybe just a couple more points and then finish up.
Yeah. So this is not the way mathematicians work, nor is it the way anyone engages in mathematics outside of school. It's not the signature of mathematics. I'm just going to skip that. I do think the elephant in the room is related to what's happening in in-field teaching. And I think some of the issues related to the support we provide for out-of-field teachers are impacted by in-field teaching. And this was really evident in our project. So here's just some of the main things we've learned. And the pandemic's had major impact, and I'm sure everyone else knows that. And I'm going to say that from our perspective, face-to-face learning to support out-of-field teachers is really critical. The issue is complex. People have talked about the teachers that they're working with being similar. Ours were not similar in any way. Any sort of variable you could think about, there was the most diverse group of teachers. And someone called this agency before, but I'm not quite sure about whether this is agency where to get a job, you have to become a maths teacher. And certainly because the department said they would see teachers as being in field, some just enrolled, they wanted the certificate and they didn't really care about the learning opportunities. But I do want to end on a very positive note that the teachers we've had through the first two cohorts, and we're currently in the third cohort, are so much better prepared to teach mathematics, but ongoing support's needed. We need to do better in Victoria and no doubt elsewhere to really develop teachers as lifelong learners. It's something that we've really noticed is challenging for the teachers who we've had in our courses, but also the teachers that they're interacting with back in their schools. And I just think we need to look at these three areas to help the situation. Initial teacher education, attrition. One of the things that I don't think has been mentioned in attrition yet is we have a lot of maths teachers in schools that aren't teaching much maths. They're doing other jobs. They're being the principal or the timetable and all those sorts of things, as well as the ones who leave the profession. And beliefs is also important. Okay, and I'll wrap up there. Thank you very much.